Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Sellers. I'm the president of National History Academy, and we're very pleased that you were able to join us today. We've got a special guest and a very good friend of National History Academy, Brent Glass, presenting today. I'd just like to let you know that we are recruiting for National History Academy this summer. We have online programs for middle school students and high school students starting July 5th and running throughout the month of July. For middle school, we have 1-week programs that are focused on different themes that should be very interesting for students. Our high school curriculum is built around the case studies of the Case Method Institute. These cases were developed by David Moss, professor at Harvard Business School, and they provide an excellent platform for students around the country and around the world to discuss important topics of American history and relate them to what's going on today. Last summer, we had over 600 students from all 50 states and 20 countries represented. And Dr. Brent Glass, well, and before I move on, check out our programs on nationalhistoryacademy.org, and you can get more information. And actually, we've just this week added 13 workshops that are shorter for both high school and middle school students that you can look into. Some of them are as short as one-day programs, but with leading educators at important historic sites in the country. Dr. Brent Glass has been a part of National History Academy from the very beginning. He was the director at the executive director of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History from 2002 to 2011. Before that, he had been the executive director of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and he was there from 1987 to 2002, and from 83 to 87, he was director of the North Carolina Humanities Council. He received his education from Lafayette College, getting his bachelor's there, a master's degree from NYU, and a doctorate from UNC Chapel Hill. For the last 10 years, he's been a museum and history consultant. He provides strategic planning, fundraising, executive recruitment, governance. When we started National History Academy, we'd actually started working with him shortly before then, but there's no better person in the country to help us build a program that's focused on place-based learning. I believe that Dr. Glass is the foremost expert in place-based learning in the country through his very broad experience, and we're thrilled to have him here today. He's not just he's really a co-founder of National History Academy. He's been so important from the very beginning, and he's not just works as a consultant for National History Academy, but he's really a co-founder of the program, and he's been a great mentor and friend to me. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Brent Glass.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks for that great introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be participating in the virtual field trips of the National History Academy, and to be involved in all the programs. And I just want to echo what Bill said, that this summer is going to be a great opportunity for students, high school and middle school students, to participate in the Academy online again this summer. But I encourage all of you to look at the website, look at all the programs that we have available. And I think it's going to be a terrific summer, just as we had last summer. I'm going to talk today to take you on a virtual field trip around the country, featuring some of the sites that I wrote about in my book, 50 Great American Places, which was published in 2016 by Simon & Schuster. And I was fortunate to, and I want to acknowledge that David McCullough wrote the foreword to this book. And he advised me when I was thinking of writing it, he said, write a book that you would want to read. And the book that I wanted to read was a book that had three purposes. I had three goals in mind. First was to encourage history education, which we're carrying out that goal and that mission with the National History Academy. I think it is so important for us to understand the context in which we are living now in this country, and history is a great resource for helping us understand our own times. The second reason for writing this book was to encourage people to go out and experience history by visiting historic sites. Now, of course, we haven't been able to do that for more than a year, but I think the country is opening up again. I hope people will take the 50 Great American Places book and put it in their glove compartment and get out and see and experience America's great historic sites. And the third reason was to encourage the preservation of historic places. One of the points that I make in the book is that history is not inevitable. History happens because people make decisions. And I think that the reason we have so many historic sites to visit is that people along the way have had the foresight and the vision to actually work hard to preserve American history. So I'm often asked, how did I come up with the list of how could you narrow a list down to 50 great American places? And I had several criteria that I used. First of all, I wanted to have geographic representation, so every region of the country is included in the book. I wanted to include a wide range of chronological time periods from pre-colonial times to the present. I chose sites that were accessible to the public, either free of charge or a nominal charge, so that was important. And I also selected 5 themes around which the history of America could be understood. And the 5 themes are freedom, war, innovation, diversity, and land. Freedom, war, innovation, diversity, and land. And so this presentation this afternoon will focus on sort of reorganizing this book along the lines of those themes. And some of the sites that you will be introduced to at in this talk have been featured in previous virtual field trips that have been sponsored over the last several weeks by the National History Academy. But now you're going to see these sites in a slightly different context. So I'm very pleased that my associate, Nicole Hamilton, is assisting me in the technical side of this talk. So Nicole, let's get started. The first theme is the theme of freedom. And freedom is captured in so many different places in American history, and we can talk about a number of ways of approaching and defining this topic. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia is probably a good place to start, and it's also a reminder that many of the sites that we are familiar with started out as in a different context than how we know them today. So with the Liberty Bell was cast in the 1750s to commemorate an important milestone in colonial Pennsylvania history. That was the 50th anniversary of the drafting of the Charter of Privileges, one of William Penn's constitutions for colonial Pennsylvania. But as time went on, the Liberty Bell became associated with the abolition movement. And so in the 1830s, the abolitionists adopted the Liberty Bell as their logo, and the name Liberty Bell was really not applied to the bell until the 1830s. So it's a good reminder that our history changes over time, and our understanding of the importance of historic sites can change over time. The next slide will take you up to Boston, and you're going to be hearing a lot in the next several years about the Freedom Trail. This is Faneuil Hall, one of the important sites associated with the meetings and organizing in Boston where one of the leading cities in the resistance to British colonial rule in the 1760s and 1770s. And we are now approaching, by 2026, we will be observing the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and a number of the sites on the Freedom Trail, which is, I believe, 16 historic sites located along a trail in Boston that runs about 3 miles. Many of those sites will be featured and be very visible in the next few years. So the Freedom Trail is an um, important site in the story of freedom. Next slide. In Seneca Falls, New York, very important landmarks of the story of freedom, and I believe we had a visit to Seneca Falls a few weeks ago. This is where the Women's Rights Convention was held in 1848, and I've always been impressed by the fact that, and on your left is Wesleyan Chapel, where the convention was held, and on your right is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home in Seneca Falls. She was one of the leaders of the Women's Rights Convention. And both these sites are National Park Service sites. I've always been impressed by the fact that the women who organized the Women's Rights Convention in July of 1848 had only put out the word about 2 weeks before the convention. They had met and they decided it was time for women to assert their rights, and they actually drafted something called the Declaration of Sentiments, in which they, for the first time, articulated the goal that women should have the right to vote. Of course, it took many more decades before that right was codified in our Constitution. But with just 2 weeks' notice, they assembled 300 people who came to Seneca Falls to meet for 2 days and to adopt the Declaration of Sentiments. And I've always been impressed with that, because any of us who have tried to organize meetings know that if we want to get 300 people to come to a meeting, we'd probably start a year ahead of time. But they did this with 2 weeks' notice, with no email, no advanced technology, and just spread the word. And they brought a number of major leaders together, including Frederick Douglass and Lucretia Mott and a number of other important leaders. So this is a very significant site in the story of freedom. The next slide. The Martin Luther King birth home and Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta are two landmarks also administered by the National Park Service. And freedom in the US, freedom involves overcoming barriers. The women at Seneca Falls had to overcome the barrier to women's rights. Martin Luther King was incredibly important leader in the 20th century civil rights movement, overcoming the barriers of Jim Crow and segregation. And his leadership was crucial in the success of that, of gaining a number of important pieces of legislation: voting rights, civil rights, housing, anti-housing discrimination. One little piece of trivia that I think is important is that when Martin Luther King was born, his family gave him the name Michael King, and for the first 5 years of his life, he was Michael King. His father, who was Michael King Sr., was a minister, and his father in the early 1930s made a trip with other ministers to Germany, and they heard the story of Martin Luther as the leader of the Protestant movement in the 16th century. And Michael King Sr. came home to Atlanta and decided to change his name to Martin Luther King Sr. and changed his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr. And I think that's significant because it shows the family's commitment and passion for reform, and just another little piece of information on the formative character of Martin Luther King. At the Ebenezer Baptist Church, you can hear a number of the sermons of Dr. King, and it's an outstanding introduction to this story of American freedom. Next slide. In Little Rock, Arkansas, I know we had a virtual field trip to Little Rock, to the Central High School in Little Rock, where in 1957, 9 African-American high school students led the integration of this high school. And the events that followed were very, very tragic, and also very major conflict over the subject of school integration. Fortunately, those students survived that year, and one of those students, Ernest Green, graduated in 1958. And at his graduation ceremony, Martin Luther King Jr. was a guest at the ceremony, and Ernest Green has been a speaker at a number of our programs for the National History Academy. But the story of freedom has to include that story of the courageous people who led the desegregation of America and the integration of schools and public places. So Central High School, which is also an operating high school today, but there is a visitor center across from the high school operated by the National Park Service, very much an important site worth visiting. Next slide. Now, on the subject of war, we've talked a little bit about the American Revolution already. Another landmark in the story of war and conflict is the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas. Originally a mission site of a Spanish mission, and there are a series of Spanish missions that are still in operation and still preserved by the National Park Service. The Alamo is an independent historic site, and associated with the War of Independence, the War of Texas Independence. And very recently, there have been a number of meetings and conversations and reports and movement to make some major changes around the Alamo and Alamo Square, as well as taking a different approach to the interpretation of Texas independence. It's another good example of a site that started out as being having one identity as a mission, and then later on as a symbol of the conflict between Texans and the Mexican government. Next slide. I know we had a visit to Gettysburg Battlefield, and this is a major landmark in America's Civil War, not only for the battle that occurred in July of 1863, but also as the site of possibly the most famous speech in American history, Lincoln's address at Gettysburg, which was given in November of 1863 to dedicate the National Cemetery there. And a visit to Gettysburg, to me, is one of the most fascinating experiences you can have to understand the context of the battle, why it was such a turning point in the American Civil War. The National Park Service does an outstanding job in bringing that conflict into and evaluating and analyzing the Civil War and the causes of the Civil War. And Gettysburg is just one of those places that has an enduring impact on anybody who visits. I would encourage you, if you have time, to take one of the horseback tours that are offered, not by the Park Service, but by private entities. It's quite a different experience to see the battlefield from the vantage point of how the cavalry saw it in July 1863. Next slide. In Montana and South Dakota, there are two landmarks associated with the Indian Wars, one of the more tragic episodes in American history, and the conflicts with the indigenous native populations of America reached a climax in the late 19th century. Little Bighorn on your left in Montana, which was the site of the defeat of General George Custer and the 7th Cavalry in July of 1876. And then on the right, the monument to the massacre at Wounded Knee, which is in South Dakota. These two sites are about a day's drive from each other, but they're really a part of the same story of this conflict between the American government and the native populations in the West. And they're both sites worth visiting. and remembering the tragic consequences of this conflict. Next slide. Two sites that I write about in 50 Great American Places are associated with World War II. On the left is the memorial at Pearl Harbor to the USS Arizona. On December 7th, 1941, the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was attacked by the Japanese Air Force. And the next day, Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war. And you can see a copy of his speech at the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. And what I always remember about looking at that typewritten speech is that Roosevelt crossed out a key phrase at the beginning of the speech. And the original speech said December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in world history. And Roosevelt crossed out world history and wrote in a day that will live in infamy. And that's how we remember that date, December 7th, 1941. We also observed an important anniversary just a couple of days ago, the successful landing in Normandy Beach, which we call D-Day, on June 6th, 1944. On the right is the honor roll plaque, a reconstruction of the honor roll that was placed by the people who were incarcerated at Minidoka camp, Japanese citizens and Japanese people who were immigrants, Japanese from Japan. 120,000 of these residents of mostly of the West Coast were incarcerated in camps for most of World War II. But astonishingly, many of the men and women in these camps volunteered to serve in the U.S. Army. And in fact, the 442nd Regiment, which was made up of all Japanese nationals, Japanese and Japanese Americans, was the most decorated regiment in World War II. And the residents at Minidoka placed this honor roll, which lists all the people from Minidoka camp, which is in southern Idaho, who were serving in the armed forces. And I believe 7 of the people who served in World War II were awarded a Medal of Honor. And this site, both Pearl Harbor and Minidoka camp, are administered by the National Park Service. Next slide. In the theme of innovation, we have to start with probably the greatest known, most famous inventor in American history, Thomas Edison. In Menlo Park, New Jersey, Edison's laboratory, which again is another National Park Service site, commemorates the astounding career of Thomas Edison, who had some spectacular successes and also some notable failures in his life. And we get an introduction into his astonishing achievements and some of his disappointments when we visit Edison's laboratory in New Jersey. Edison was such a monumental figure and so revered, and was credited with inventing the incandescent light bulb, that when he died in 1931, there was a call for everyone to turn off their lights in honor of Thomas Edison, and President Hoover said, "We can't do that. It would be catastrophic. We were too dependent on electricity." So Thomas Edison is a visit to his lab is an important landmark in the story of innovation. Next slide. The railroad is one of the shaping technologies in American history, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad shops in Baltimore commemorates and tells that story of the early days of railroading. One of the stories that I really like is that on July 4th, 1828, there were two groundbreaking ceremonies, one here in Washington, where the President John Quincy Adams and others broke ground for the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And in Baltimore, they were setting the cornerstone for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And both the canal and railroad were transportation technologies, rival technologies that whose goal was to open up the Ohio Valley for Easterners to settle. And at that point, no one knew which technology, which form of transportation would succeed. But we now know that the railroad won out and became the defining technology of the 19th and much of the 20th century. And on the right is Grand Central Terminal in New York City, a landmark to railroad construction and railroad station construction. And the Grand Central Terminal is credited with transforming Midtown Manhattan and is still an amazing site to visit today. And they offer tours at the terminal. I heartily recommend a visit. It's never as empty as you see it in this slide. And even after the pandemic, I think people are coming back and transportation is reviving in New York and throughout the country. Next slide. In Dearborn, Michigan, right very close to the Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village is the Ford Rouge Center, where you can take a tour and a factory tour and see F-150 trucks being manufactured by robotics. And Henry Ford was fascinated with technology and an innovator. And the theme of innovation is very much on display at the Ford Rouge Center and also in Greenfield Village and the Henry Ford Museum, one of the best history museums in my estimation in the country, and in Dearborn, Michigan. Highly recommended. Next slide. The Hoover Dam in Nevada, on the border of Nevada and Arizona, dedicated in 1936, was a colossal achievement for its time. Today, and it produced electricity, it provided water for irrigation, and for recreation. Today, with the persistent drought in the West, the Hoover Dam is now being reevaluated as to how what its impact has been on the history of the Southwest. But it clearly is worth a visit and worth taking a tour of this monumental work of engineering. Next slide. In just south of Minneapolis is a shopping mall in Edina, Minnesota, the first enclosed shopping mall in America, Southdale Mall, dedicated in 1956 and designed by Victor Grun, an Austrian immigrant who had the idea of shopping malls as social and cultural centers as well as commercial centers. And fortunately, Southdale Mall has been preserved, but I think it's fair to say that the shopping mall is becoming more of a historic relic of an earlier time of suburban life that I hope a handful will be preserved in the future, so that we can learn about the mid 20th century and the post-war suburban boom in this country. But Southdale Mall happens to be one of the more successful shopping malls, and I also I hope we pay more attention to the achievements of Victor Grun, who was very, very influential in commercial architecture. Next slide. The theme of diversity is the fourth theme that I talk about in my book. Music, of course, is a great theme in American history, and Ryman Auditorium, the shrine of country and Western music in Nashville, has been restored and preserved and is still the home of major concerts. This is another good example of a building being repurposed. It started out as a church, and in the 1890s, But by the 1930s, it was converted into a concert hall and became the home of the Grand Ole Opry, which was at first a great radio program and then later became an important location for live concerts. I hope that with the pandemic ending, we can see concerts being held again in Ryman Auditorium. Next slide. Stepping back in time to talk about our diverse cultural traditions, I've included two pre-colonial sites in my book. On the left is the Cahokia Mounds in southern Illinois along the Mississippi River. The mound builders of the 11th and 12th century and 13th centuries were a very prolific native indigenous people who built a city which by the mid 13th century, around 1250, actually had more people living in that city than lived in London, England at the same time, about 10,000 people, and about 30,000 people living on the outskirts of Cahokia. It's an incredible story, and it's very much well preserved. Many of the mounds are still preserved today as part of a state park in Illinois. You can climb to the top of the tallest mound, which is called Monk's Mound, shown here on the left, and look out across the Mississippi River and see the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. So the story of the mound builders, and then on the right, the story of the Puebloan indigenous people in Colorado, and this is at Mesa Verde. Both these sites are important landmarks that tell us that the indigenous peoples, while we think of them as being nomadic and being moving from one place to another, established some major settlements with important lessons to be learned about urban planning, about architecture, and about adjusting to the environment. On the right, you're seeing the famous cliff dwellings, Cliff Palace, at Mesa Verde. The Mesa Verde site is administered by the National Park Service, and the Cahokia Mounds administered by the state parks in Illinois. Both of these sites flourished, as I said, in the 11th and 12th and 13th, 11th and 12th centuries. By the 14th century, there were very, very few people living at Cahokia and Mesa Verde. And the reasons for the end of these two civilizations is still debated by scientists and archaeologists today. Next slide. One of my favorite places in the 50 Great American Places is the Mission St. Javier in just south of Tucson, Arizona. This was the last of the Spanish missions built in Arizona, built by the Franciscans, although the mission itself was started by the Jesuits in the late 17th century. By the late 18th century, in the 1780s, the Franciscan order began the construction of this wonderful chapel using indigenous labor. And on the inside, next slide, on the interior of the mission, we'll have the next slide, is this incredibly rich, detailed work of art, of indigenous art, and which includes statues of the Virgin Mary and the saints, and all clothed with various clothing, that hand-woven clothing, and has been well preserved, but still very much at risk. And there is an organization called Patronato that raises funds to preserve the mission at St. Javier. Next slide. The diverse cultural traditions of our country are certainly represented by the Statue of Liberty, and as a built and dedicated in the 1880s, 1886, and has been associated with freedom and also with diverse ethnic and national groups coming for many generations. It's another example of a historic landmark that changed its identity over time. When the statue was dedicated in the 1880s, it was a gift from France, and the idea was to commemorate Americans' unity and the abolition of slavery at the end of the Civil War. In fact, at the base of the statue, and let's have the next slide, the base of the statue, you can see a broken chains around the ankle of the Statue of Liberty, and that was symbolizing the end of the abolition of slavery and the breaking of the chains of slavery. Over time, the statue became associated with immigration and with the freedom of people that people experienced coming to the United States. So a very different example of diversity and our diverse cultural traditions. Next slide. And the last theme I will mention, and then be happy to take any of your comments and questions, is the influence of land on American history. This is the Forks of the Ohio in Pittsburgh, where the Monongahela River, which is on the left, and on the right, and the Allegheny River on the left, come together to form the Ohio River. And it's a good reminder of how important waterways were in forming not only the cities, but also the influence in the history of America. In the 18th century, the French and Indian War, which was fought in the 1750s and 1760s, much of that conflict focused around control of the Forks of the Ohio, which was the gateway to the West at that time. Next slide. On the West Coast, at San Francisco Bay is the former site of the Presidio, the northernmost Spanish fort that was built that was started in 1776. So at the same time that the English colonies on the East Coast were breaking away from Great Britain, the Spanish were establishing an outpost on what later became San Francisco on the West Coast. And when one of the American generals, John Fremont, saw this entrance to San Francisco Bay, he said, "I'm going to call this site Chrysopoli," which in Greek meant Golden Gate. And he said, "This site will be as important to North America as the Golden Horn has been to Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire." And I think he was right, because San Francisco Bay has been a formative land part of the land and influencing the history of the West Coast and all of North America. And what we see here is the Golden Gate Bridge, which was built in the 1930s. Next slide. And so I conclude with a landmark that's located in Red Cloud, Nebraska, celebrating the American prairie. So we talked about the waterways, the Forks of the Ohio, the coastal feature of San Francisco Bay, and also the Great Prairie here in Nebraska. And the Willa Cather home is located in Red Cloud, and the Willa Cather Foundation preserves this home place, one of America's great novelists whose novels written in the early 20th century capture not only the feeling and influence of the land, but also powerful stories about the immigrant experience in that part of the country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What's significant as well at the work of the foundation is significant because not only are they preserving Willa Cather's home and several buildings in Red Cloud associated with Willa Cather and her writing, but they also have purchased several hundred acres of unplowed prairie just outside of Red Cloud. So you can visit this memorial prairie and see the landscape the way Willa Cather saw it when she was writing and growing up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And with that, we'll have one more slide, and you can see my website and my contact information, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
That was wonderful, Brent. Thank you so much. We do have some questions for you. Let's start with, how do people learn differently at these historic sites?
I think it's a great question because I believe the historic sites encourages visual literacy. We like to talk about historical literacy by reading either primary sources or sometimes reading secondary sources. But I think it's important to look at historical evidence by actually seeing the site itself and understanding and reading the site using our senses, mostly our visual senses, but also listening and touching if we're allowed to. And I think that the historical sites are three-dimensional texts that can be read. So it helps to have a guide. It helps to have a park ranger or a museum educator, and I think we've been meeting some extraordinary people in these virtual field trips who are so knowledgeable and passionate about their particular sites. So it helps to have a guide. I would encourage people to do a little reading before they visit some of these sites, so you can more fully appreciate what it is you're experiencing and seeing. I also would mention I think going to a historic site or a museum is a visual experience, a sensory experience, but it's also a social experience. I think it's important to go with your family or with your friends or your class and learn from each other.
Had you been to most of the sites before you wrote the book?
Yes, I didn't feel I could write the book without visiting every site. And many of the sites I had visited earlier in my career, but some of them I wanted to revisit, and some I visited for the first time. I had never been to Cahokia, for example, in southern Illinois, and that was a wonderful experience. And the visitor center there and the staff there are very knowledgeable about this very unique site, which, by the way, is has been declared a World Heritage Site.
Are there any sites you really wanted to include but just didn't make the cut?
I'm often asked that question, and the answer is definitely yes. And I'm thinking of writing a second volume so that I can include many of the places that I have visited that I didn't include. I'll just give an example. Fort Ticonderoga that we've visited in our virtual field trips, I think is a place I'd like to include. There are several sites in the West that I just did in the Northwest that I associated with the Lewis and Clark expedition that I didn't include. I think I should include at least one lighthouse in the future, because lighthouses are such an important navigational tool and navigational aid in American history. The city of Louisville has a particular interest in sports history for me. The Kentucky Derby, Churchill Downs, the Muhammad Ali Center, and the Louisville Slugger Center are all located in Louisville. Baseball, boxing, and horse racing. So I think there could be a good essay written about Louisville as a center of American sports.
Great. Looking forward to the second one. It sounds like you've got a lot lined up for it. We have from the Facebook chat, considering accessibility, are there certain sites that you remember as particularly accessible for all, or others that you know have difficulties?
Well, some of the, I think many historic sites now are taking into consideration the need for physical accessibility. I'm thinking in particular, one difficult site probably to navigate would be Mesa Verde, because there's a fair amount of climbing into the cliff dwellings that might be difficult for someone who has a physical disability. But most of the sites, but you can still, much of Mesa Verde is accessible. And so I think it's a great question, and I think it's worthwhile, of course, to call ahead or go to a website and make sure that there are ways for people to access the site. But most sites today are aware of that, of those challenges and the need to be accessible.
We have some teachers in the chat. One participant mentioned that they're going to be teaching 8th grade U.S. history for the first time. What resources do you have or do you recommend to help make the kids love history as much as we all do?
Wow, that's well, if it's American history, I think it's important to have a mix of written, visual, oral, and physical evidence as a way of introducing students to history right from the beginning. I think sometimes we depend too much on secondary sources, and we don't use primary sources or photographs or maps, and oral history where it's available, and also visiting historic places. It doesn't have to be a World Heritage Site in your community. Every community has a physical site that can be instructive as a way of learning about American history. And I think it's really important that we introduce students right from the beginning to the fact that history is an ongoing discipline. It's that historians argue with each other about the meaning of historical events and historical individuals, people, so that we should encourage students to think critically about the past and not necessarily just accept everything as a fixed moment in time that's unchangeable, that cannot require new interpretations. We're learning new things. There's always something new under the sun. And I hope teachers would convey that right at the beginning.
What American sites that no longer exist do you wish you could have visited?
Wow, that's, well, in New York, in fact, the whole modern preservation movement in this country can be associated with the demolition of Pennsylvania Station in Manhattan, which was a magnificent railroad station that was demolished in the 1960s. And when that station was demolished, New York passed a major landmark preservation statute and created a landmark preservation commission. And I don't want to misquote Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, but when there was a debate about tearing down or altering Grand Central Terminal, she said something that might be a good way to summarize why preservation is so important. She said, if our children are not inspired by the places and landmarks of the past, how will they have the courage to fight for the future? And I thought that was a great way to summarize. This is when she was leading or one of the leaders to preserve Grand Central Terminal, but it applies to a number of places around the country. Places that aren't here anymore that I wish were here. I think Penn Station would be one of them. I think there are archaeological sites around the country that have not been preserved that would be worth preserving. A number of railroad stations around the country. I happen to like old industrial buildings, and we've lost a number of those great industrial buildings over the years. So I think it's a great question.
Along that same line of thinking, many important African American sites have not been preserved. How can we still learn from those sites and landscapes, even if they're no longer there?
Well, it's an interesting that you mentioned that, because the National Trust for Historic Preservation has a special initiative now to preserve African American sites. And the National Trust just published a list of 11 endangered buildings and landmarks around the country. And most of those are associated with African American history. And one category within that theme of African American history are the Rosenwald schools. And I think at one point there were close to 5,000 schools that were built through the philanthropy of Julius Rosenwald and in partnership with Booker T. Washington. And I think only a few hundred of those schools have survived, but those schools tell us a lot about the passion for education in the African American community, the phenomenal philanthropy of Julius Rosenwald and the leadership of Booker T. Washington, and the challenge of providing equal education for most of the 20th century that those schools represent.
We had a question from Facebook Live. Have you ever been to Nantucket Island?
I have not. I've been to Cape Cod, but I haven't been to Nantucket. But it's another one on my list that I would love to visit, but I have not been there.
Which site in the book would you consider the best sort of hidden gem?
Wow. That's I go back to Cahokia only because whenever I've made this presentation in person, most people surprisingly are not aware of it and not aware of its importance historically and even as an international site. I think people aren't as aware of the Presidio in San Francisco, even though it's right there in the city, because it was an Army base for so long. People around the country are not as familiar with this wonderful 1,500-acre park in the northern end of San Francisco. But other hidden gems, I'll have to think about that. It's I happen to be a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright and Taliesin in Wisconsin. His home that he built in the early 20th century, I think, is a gem. And almost any building that Frank Lloyd Wright is associated with is worth visiting. But Taliesin has a particularly tragic story that you learn about in reading the book, associated with Wright and some of his in his personal life.
Could you tell us a bit more about NHA's History Field Trips initiative and the Connecting Classrooms to Sites?
I'm going to ask you to talk about that. I think you and Amy and the whole team have been doing such a great job of connecting us. I'll just put in a little advance notice that next week we're going to visit Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, where we're working on creating a museum about criminal justice in the town of Ossining in Westchester County, and one of the most important sites associated with criminal justice in this country. So we'll be visiting there next week. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about the program.
Great, absolutely. So for the teachers watching, for everyone other than these weekly 4 p.m. Programs, for teachers, you can go to our website, again, nationalhistoryacademy.org. And there you can find a list of different sites that we work with, and we arrange virtual field trips. So if you are looking to kind of schedule one of these more personalized for your classroom, you can go online on that website and fill that out, and we'd be happy to arrange a virtual field trip with your classroom.
I would endorse this approach very much, as Bill Sellers described at the beginning of the program. The idea of combining on-site visits with the case studies that David Moss and the Case Study Institute provide is a totally unique way of looking at American history. I don't think there's another program that takes this kind of approach of the power of place, site-based learning, along with this very intense look at specific issues in American history through the case study program. So I'm completely on board after we're heading into our 4th summer, and really excited about it. Any other questions?
Just a couple more. We are running short on time here. Are there any new or upcoming sites or museums in the country that you're looking forward to?
Well, one that comes to mind is in Charleston, South Carolina. The International African American Museum is under construction, and a good friend of ours, Elijah Hayward, is the chief operating officer. I believe they have a new CEO, Tanya Matthews. I hope I got that right. Is the new CEO, and that's going to open a year from now. And it's going to be a very interesting look at both the historic site because of the commemorating the slave trade that took place in Charleston, but also a well-designed, beautiful garden space and a beautiful museum that should open about a year from now, I believe. And a credit to former Mayor Joe Riley of Charleston, who had the vision for this museum many years ago and has been able to see it through.
Great. And one final question to end this visit with. What do you hope people take away most from your book when they read it?
I hope people are inspired to, as I said at the beginning, go out and see American history. I hope they're inspired to preserve historic sites. And I hope they're inspired to learn more about American history in general. American history is even though we're a relatively young country, it's a very complex story. There are many, sometimes competing narratives for understanding American history. But I hope that the book is not the last word, but the first word in being inspired to explore and understand our nation's complex and compelling history.
Great. Brent, thank you again so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Thank you everyone for watching, and be sure to be back here with us next week, Wednesday at 4 p.m. for a virtual tour with Sing Sing Museum. And for those high school and middle school students out there, or if you know any, please be sure to check out our website for different history and civics education opportunities this summer. And for the teachers out there, again, on our website, you can see the online field trips section where if you wanted to schedule one for your class or to have that on board for next year, you can check that out as well. Again, that is nationalhistoryacademy.org. And I will see you all back here next week, and have a beautiful rest of your day.